so we're working on this in Foundation. So we're very interested in composing and formalisms for composition. We're extremely interested in this. So, well, I think Robert can speak for himself. I think it's better. And so we have Jose Antonio, who's also a physicist here at UNAM. Carlos as well. Sebas is another. So he's a postdoc. He's at the U.S. In the U.S., he's interested in machine learning and category theory, and so generally applied category theory. So it's basically right now it's us plus some people in the YouTube channel, and of course Bob is with us. So he's not at UNAM, but he's a regular at the seminar. And yeah, and well, Mehmet has been with us in a couple seminars, and yeah. So basically, we're interested in applications to several things, but yeah, a lot in physics, and yeah, we're very interested in composition of things, compositional structures, I guess. Yeah.
That sounds like a great fit for category theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, Carlos is interested in more in applications to topology, I guess. But I'm not sure. How about you, Carlos? What are you interested in?
Sorry, Juan, whenever you want to start, yeah, you're ready. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I think that was, okay. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to this new session of our category seminar. We're very happy to introduce today's speaker, Brendan Fong from the Topos Institute, who will be speaking to us about Cospans as a tool for composition. We would like to encourage everyone to make questions at any time during or after the talk. Questions can be asked in Spanish, and in that case, we would be very happy to translate for Brendan. Yeah, please, Brendan, take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks Juan and Carlos for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to just be here in this space and speak to you all. As Juan just said, please do ask questions. Feel free to interrupt anytime. So today I want to say a few words about, I should also say actually before I begin too, this is sort of fairly experimental format for a talk for me. So if anything is not readable or things too small, please do interrupt and tell me. I really appreciate the feedback, and I also want you to be able to follow what's going on. So that'd be really helpful. Okay, so today, as this title says, I want to talk a bit about Cospans as a tool for composition, and in particular for composition of network systems and representing the network diagrammatic languages that go along with them. But to begin, let me sort of frame or motivate the work by just talking about a few things that are going on at Topos. So we're a new sort of independent nonprofit research institution based in Berkeley. We opened in January, and sort of in sort of 5 words, we sort of build tools for cooperation. And a core part of our methodology is, as of interest to the seminar, is category theory, because we believe that at its essence, category theory is sort of a mathematical way of thinking about a science of things like relationships and composition, integration, cooperation, communication. It provides not only the framework for sort of describing these things, but also for sort of rigorous analysis of these things, ways to reason about them, and hence hopefully technologies that are safe and that are verifiable, that are transparent, and we hope also sort of broadly beneficial to the public, so to society at large. But more concretely, I want to talk about a particular, or begin at least by mentioning a particular project, sort of that is a central focus at Topos, which you've already seen already in Sophie Lipkin's talk last year. And sort of Jade Master also mentioned aspects of the theory behind this thing. But so CatLab is a computer algebra package for doing category theory or applied category theory. So for manipulating categorical structures. And one of the core purposes is to be software for composing scientific models. So here's just an example sort of salient to the present moment, where right now we want to still be predicting sort of infection curves of this pandemic as it goes on over time. So we want to sort of produce these numbers over here. And to do this, we want to amalgamate information or models, sort of ways of understanding the pandemic that are distributed over sort of spatially, yes, but also over different sorts of expertise. So between sort of these, I don't know, epidemiological models around disease spread, models around sort of human behavior and how they respond to certain policies, economic models, and so on. And so no one person has the expertise or the access to describe these models in their entirety. And so we want to build them from parts. So the goal is to sort of create some sort of computational artifact like this in the center here, which is a scientific model, but it's built from these sort of various parts, which just represent individual elements of the process of, I don't know, in this case, disease exposure and spread. And so what CatLab does is provide software support for composing and computing with these models. And the sort of theoretical grounding they use in this particular case is known as structured cospans, which you've already seen, if not sort of in full generality, at least in part in Jade's talk, talking about composing graphs and Petri nets and so on. And the basic idea is that we have a cospan in the sense that we have sort of two sort of objects, X and Y, and a third object in the middle, and maps, which have the middle object as a common codomain, right? So that's a cospan. What makes it a structured cospan, or another very related formalism is a decorated cospan, is that we want to view this cospan as sort of running across two different structures or two different categories. The sort of the feet of the cospan, these things in blue, are just in this case finite sets, right? And they're describing some interface to a larger structure, which in this case here you might think of as a transition in a Petri net, or a Petri net, or in general, or some form of directed graph, right? So we could say that this sort of pink stuff here in the middle decorates this cospan with additional structure to then sort of allow the composition. Or another way to think about it is this is the cospan of sort of Petri nets, but it's structured in a way that we make these things free Petri nets. So in last week's Topos colloquium, John Baez gave a really interesting vision, I think, for mathematics over the next century, and in particular talked about this particular work, both the mathematical side and its computer implementation. And another Topos faculty member, Valeria de Plava, who's at this talk, asked this question, which I thought was really interesting. There are many formalisms for describing composition of systems and so on. So why structured cospans? And to paraphrase sort of John's response, which I think is a good one, is that there are many formalisms indeed, and ultimately we want to be implementing as many as relevant to the problem at hand to solve the problems. But structured cospans are one that we know well in the applied category theory community, and have been implemented here and useful in this particular case. And so that's, I think, enough to think about why they're relevant, I guess, to this software for, say, composing models or modeling the pandemic. But it's worth meditating, I think, on this question a bit more to try and extract out exactly what the cospans are getting at, what the deeper structure is that we're trying to express. And so I thought it'd be worth spending this hour exploring that. And I'd like to do it sort of in 4 parts. Firstly, I just want to talk about cospans. And so this is really just, I guess, talking about the question, why cospans in particular, sorry. And then cospans are structure available to you in sort of settings with finite colimits, but this is not always the case. And so in more general settings, we might want to mimic these structures. And so this next section of hypergraph, which leads to the notion of hypergraph category. And this next section of hypergraph categories is really about sort of what is useful or what is the syntactic structure that cospans express. Then I want to provide another view of hypergraph categories as cospan algebras, which provide a more sort of unbiased view, which also just try and get at the essence of what they're doing, which is about sort of identifying variables or sort of an algebra of basically calling things equal. And then lastly, sort of why structured cospans within this framework, then I want to see structured cospans as a way of constructing these cospan algebras or hypergraph categories as a convenient sort of syntax for constructing this world where we can express this, I guess, network style structure. Okay, so to begin, section 1 is on cospans. And I think I'm sort of treading over well-known ground here, but I think it's good to begin with sort of the core insight, which is that colimits are about sort of building an object for our parts. So we have some category here, or we have some category C where we're allowed to draw these diagrams, right? We have these objects and morphisms expressed in this sort of pink structure here. And we want to sort of amalgamate that into a single object. And so that object is the colimit. So each of these sort of objects in the pink diagram over here are sort of mapped into, they become a part of this larger colimit object in a way that respects the relationships that we've laid out between these objects. And it's sort of the object that is built from this parts in the sense that if these things relate to anything else, then the relationship factors through the colimit object. So in some ways, if we're in a rich enough setting and we're just talking about integration of systems or composition of systems, the world of colimits is already a very good way to be thinking about things. But one reason to use cospans then is that if we want to talk about finite colimits, it's nice to have a syntax for sort of constructing them compositionally, rather than just drawing these diagrams and saying let's produce the colimit. What I want to present cospans as here is just a convenient syntax. If we really like the syntax of categories, or in particular monoidal categories, then cospans transport this sort of process of constructing colimits into this very familiar language, which is supported, say, by CatLab as a computer algebra package based on categories. So, sorry, let me just move my notes over. So let me just review some basic structure. So in this talk, I'll just write it out. Let C be a category with finite colimits. So let C have finite colimits. And so to remind you, a definition, I think going back to Benamo, is that there's this symmetric monoidal category, cospan C. So I'm just going to write SMC for symmetric monoidal category. And the objects of the category are the objects of C. And the morphisms are these things called cospans, which again are these pairs of arrows with a common codomain. So they're cospans in C. And then to give the monoidal category structure, we need to talk about sort of composition. Composition is given by pullback. I'm sorry, push out. So that is, if we have two of these cospans with a common leg, this common leg y, then the composite cospan is sort of this cospan, right? We push out over the center span and then we compose. And finally, it's a monoidal category or symmetric monoidal category, but I'll just give the monoidal structure. So the unit is the initial object, and the monoidal product is just the coproduct of two objects. Okay, so that's sort of the basic structure at hand, right? No, oops, that's not what I want to do. Sorry. Let me see if I can try and avoid. No, okay. Let me try and continue first. Actually, that's going to be important to me. Sorry. I'm going to try and move that out of the way. Sorry, still figuring this out. So I'm hoping to still have that readable and visible to you, but I want to make space to talk about some other things. So in particular, let me remind you of a sort of well-known sort of theorem, which is that a category has finite colimits if it has pushouts and finite coproducts. So what this theorem is really, I mean, this is really sort of a pointer to a larger structure, which says that if we have pushouts and finite coproducts, then there is sort of an algorithm to construct all finite colimits or any given finite colimit using sort of sequences of these structures. So let me try and so this is relevant because if you notice, these sort of elementary finite colimits are the ones available to us by sort of the structure of the cospan category, right? So in fact, what we need is the initial object for this theorem, but conveniently the structure or the syntax of symmetric monoidal categories gives us the coproduct, binary coproducts as well. Okay, so as an example of this, we have, say we want to construct the equalizer of two maps. The equalizer, sorry, the co-equalizer of the co-equalizer of this diagram here is given by the composite of cospans. So what we can do is we can promote any arrow to sort of a cospan where this is the identity. And in fact, we can do that to both F and G and take their coproduct, sort of. So we get this map here. There is also, by sort of co-pairing the identity on, say, X with itself, we get a map by the universal property of the coproduct from X plus X to X. We can put the identity map here, and we can also do the same for Y. Sorry, this was meant to be the identity map here. And if we compose these cospans, that is, if we take these sort of iterated pushouts, then this object here at the top is the co-equalizer object of this diagram, this parallel pair of arrows F and G. So to think about what's going on here, just within the syntax of monodal categories, and I'm going to use string diagrams, what we've done is we've sort of taken arrows in C and viewed them as arrows in cospan C, just by the natural inclusion, that is, by putting the identity arrow on the other side. We've done this to both F and G, and we've taken the monoidal product, the co-product. But we've also got these special maps from, so this goes from X to Y, this goes from X to Y. And we've noticed that there are special maps from X to X plus X, and special maps from sort of Y plus Y to Y. And by taking this composite just in the monoidal category, we have constructed the colimit object. So the question I want to explore is, what is this special syntax here? What is the cospan category giving us that allows us to make these constructions? And more generally, in cases where we don't have colimits, then what do we need to mimic this process of composition to construct something similar to colimits? All right. So that's where we're going next. But just before let me mention that this idea of sort of cospans being the language for constructing colimits is really nicely explored in the short note by Roseborough, Sabadini, and Walters, called Calculating Colimits Compositionally. So these ideas, which are sort of just sketched, are sort of made much more rigorous there. Okay, but again, this exploration of what syntax we had to be able to construct these sort of these colimits just using composition brings us to this notion of hypergraph category. And I'm going to take a slightly sort of, I don't know, slightly longer path or slightly indirect path to making the definition, just to try and motivate the structure a bit more. So one thing by way of motivation is just to talk about what we're trying to get at the structure of the basic structure afforded to us by cospan categories. And so I want to begin by looking at the minimal structure that supports this, which is the free category with finite colimits on one object, which is the category of finite sets and functions. So finset is the free category with finite colimits on one object. And I think it's worth, so by finset, again, I mean the category of finite sets. In fact, I'm going to be working with a skeleton. So the category of where the objects are just sort of a canonical set of each finite cardinality, and the morphisms of functions between them. And I think it's worth just sort of thinking about how we interpret or cospans and colimits in this category. So just a very small example is to talk about, say, this particular colimit here, where we have three sets, and it's going to get a bit messy, but there's one function which maps this dot to, there's one function that maps, this is the identity function here, and then on the right-hand side, there's a function that from the bottom thing here to this thing here that maps both dots to this dot here. So maybe I'll color that in blue. And so what is the colimit doing for us? Well, the colimits in finite sets are essentially about sort of closing equivalence relations or taking quotients. The colimit says, well, this thing here says we should consider these two dots the same, and this thing here, or this is to be considered the same as this, which is to be considered the same as this. And therefore, when we take the colimit, it has sort of 3 dots, where this one here is exactly just the image of all of these. And then these 2 extra dots come along from the right, not sort of identified with anything. But we see this is a way of talking about sort of equivalences of things. We're sort of closing over connected components or something like that. Or in the world of sort of these Petri nets and this CatLab software, we've got this way of talking about when 2 variables should be the same. So in Sophie's talk, she referred to this idea as sort of resource sharing. There are some variables, resources that live on some wires, and we can sort of identify these wires and say these resources are shared, they're the same. So that's the sort of, I guess, the interpretation of colimits in finite sets that we're trying to bring along for the ride as we go to more complicated circumstances. So having talked a bit about the sort of intuitive semantics, I'm going to focus more on the syntax now. So let me make another definition, which is that in a symmetric monoidal category, a commutative monoid actually, let me motivate this a little bit. I want to talk about syntactic structures in an arbitrary monoidal category. So I'm just going to do it at the beginning by way of example and talk about at least what it means for an object to have the structure or the syntax of a commutative monoid on it. And so a commutative monoid in this category C tensor is an object X, and then and morphisms, I'm going to call it mu from X tensor X to X, and eta from the, actually, I'll use a more neutral notation, from the monoidal unit to X. And I'm going to draw these with sort of special icons. So here's one special icon for mu, and here's the special icon for eta. And we want these things to obey a bunch of equations. So these equations are, I guess, familiar from what you might already expect a commutative monoid is, right? So these are unitality equations that say, I guess, if we produce a unit and then we multiply that with using the mu structure, this is the same as identity. And it doesn't matter if we do this, usually say on the left or the right, but because I'm drawing my diagrams left to right, it's on the top or on the bottom. Then there's a commutativity law. So this is my icon for the symmetry, the swap or the braiding in the symmetric monoidal category. And so that's this commutative law. And then we have the associative law. Right. So so that's sort of a syntax that we can talk about in any monoidal category. And to give an example, in any category with finite colimits, every object, let's see, every object X is equipped. So I'm going to just is a commutative monoid, but really, I mean, is equipped with the structure or canonically equipped with the structure of a commutative monoid where mu is this sort of co-pairing of the identity that we talked about previously, and eta is this unique map from the initial object. Okay. So to manage these structures to sort of manage this notion of monoidal theory, I want to introduce this notion of a prop, which is just a prop is a strict symmetric monoidal category in which, now when a symmetric monoidal category is strict, we can talk sort of an actual monoid of objects, because because indeed associativity is defined of the monoidal product is true on the nose rather than defined up to isomorphism, and in which the monoid of objects is just the natural numbers under addition, right? So for example, if we think about this skeletal version of fin set, then fin set is a prop. And in fact, fin set and these commutative monoids are very closely related in the following sense. So I'm going to say fin set is the prop or the theory of commutative monoids. And what this means sort of a bit more precisely is that there's this sort of natural correspondence between commutative monoids in any symmetric monoidal category C and strict monoidal functors from fin set with this plus monoidal structure to C, right? Strict symmetric monoidal functors. So in another sense, this sort of definition of a theory of these of commutative monoids, so this definition of commutative monoids, this sort of generators and relations presentation over here, gives a presentation for the category of finite sets. That's another way of thinking about what this means. So if a category has finite colimits, every object is canonically equipped with a commutative monoid structure. And in fact, this is almost the definition of a category with finite colimits. So there's the theorem of Fox, it's quite an old theorem, I think from the 70s, that states that, I guess there's a notion of monoid homomorphism. And a category has finite colimits if and only if every object is naturally equipped with a commutative monoid structure, and every morphism is natural, is a homomorphism for the structure. So we're sort of interested in that, but we're more interested in the structure that comes from Cospan itself, rather than just the underlying finitely co-complete, the underlying category with finite colimits. And so you can also make a similar sort of definition in for sort of the structure that is expressed by Cospan. And so here's my definition. Because it involves a lot of diagrams, oopsies, I pulled it out here. But there's this more general, or there's this other algebraic structure which we can talk about in objects, which is a special commutative Frobenius monoid on an object. And it equips an object with four maps, these sort of monoid multiplication and a monoid unit, but also sort of a comonoid, so the opposite, these dual maps. And indeed, these maps are required to form exactly well, they're required to form a commutative monoid, that's what this expresses, And the sort of opposite maps, or the transposers, are required to form the transpose structure, commutative comonoid. And then the special and commutative stuff refers to two extra laws that they must obey. So this is known as the Frobenius law here, and this is known as the special law here. So we call these sort of special commutative Frobenius monoids. And so I'll try and fit this on the same thing so you can see it all at once. A theorem here, due to lack, is that cospan, in the same way that fin set is the prop for commutative monoids, cospan fin set is the prop for special commutative Frobenius monoids. Sorry, that's an S. And as an example of a special commutative Frobenius monoid, in fact, just as in any category of finite colimits, every object is sort of canonically a commutative monoid, in cospan C, every object is a special commutative Frobenius monoid. And we do this by the sort of way that we sort of saw in this previous slide here on constructing colimits. So this map here is this sort of canonical monoid map in the underlying category C, and we can transpose the cospan that it lifts to get this cospan here, which is the corresponding co-multiplication or comonoid map. And then it turns out that by just properties of colimits, these two maps always obey the Frobenius law and the special law. Finally, while I've got these up on the slide, I want to just give a bit more interpretation of this sort of special commutative Frobenius monoid and how it relates to these ideas of connection and so on. In particular, sorry, I'll try and make a tiny bit more space. There's this result, which we can call, which is sort of known as the spider law, or spider theorem, which says, just through an example, that sort of as far as a special commutative Frobenius monoid goes, only the pattern of connections, or the connectivity, matters when doing composition. So if you notice, basically all of these laws here represent ways of sort of connecting inputs and outputs, and they sort of say that it doesn't matter how we connect these three inputs to this output, whether we do it sort of first by connecting the first two, then the third one, or connecting the second two, then the result with the first one, it results in the same morphism, the same structure. So more generally then, I can draw sort of any sort of diagram built from these sort of structures, say like this. And in fact, maybe I'll toss out that thing there. And then because it's fully connected and it only has these two inputs and two outputs, I know by this sort of theorem that this thing is just equal to this morphism with the same connectivity pattern. And indeed, if I sort of made it more complicated by, I don't know, adding an extra connected component, that would be equal to, for example, this sort of structure here. So again, it's this sort of structure of a special commutative Frobenius monoid is really just expressed through the statement. And it says that it's about identifying wires, and it doesn't matter how we identify them. All we're interested in the end is the connected components. Okay, so that's the notion of a special commutative Frobenius monoid. Any questions at this stage? No. Okay. So a hypergraph category, getting to this definition, a hypergraph category is just this property of that we identified of cospan. It's a symmetric monoid category in which every object is equipped with the structure of a special commutative Frobenius monoid in a way compatible with the tensor product. So note that this is just, it's not requiring compatibility with the morphisms of the structure in some sort of naturality condition or anything. That would get us, that would be much stronger and get us much closer to sort of where having finite colimits. But it does require compatibility with the tensor product. And what this means just here is that there are sort of, there's a unit condition and a binary condition as usual. The Frobenius structure on the unit should just be some canonical one that comes from the identities and unities. And it means that if we want to identify the Frobenius structure on a tensor product, it's just given by the tensor product of the Frobenius structure on the sort of components on X and Y here, up to some braiding, up to some of the monoidal structure. So an example is, of course, Cospans C. That's the motivating example. But just to give you another example, sort of the category of relations, so sets and relations, binary relations, is another example where, for example, the map from X to X times X is just given by the diagonal. And I guess the map from sort of the monoidal unit to X is given by the whole space. So that's, we'll call this just X. Okay, so the essence of this structure, though, goes back to what we were talking about with these sort of Frobenius monoids, which is just that this is now a richer, we have a string diagram language for monoidal categories, but now we have these extra sort of spidery network maps that allow us to split wires and combine wires. And so now in a hypergraph category, a generic sort of string diagram looks somewhat like this. Okay, so this is, I guess, very convenient because when we're talking about sort of how the syntax of Cospans supports construction of finite colimits, the real structure is that it's the hypergraph category Cospan. It provides the full syntax to let us sort of construct these co-equalizers or sort of more general finite colimits. And I should also make a note that this process of what we call, sort of in a technical term, supplying each object with the structure of a prop or some sort of monoidal theory is fairly, well, it is this general way of saying we don't want the full sort of natural structure, but we do want some weaker structure that lets us express some of the parts. So a major vein that has been showing up recently is in the work of Tobias Fritz and Paolo Perrone. I think Paolo gave a talk a few weeks ago on Markov categories, which provide sort of similarly a synthetic framework for doing probability, where you just equip each object not with a structure of special commutative Frobenius monoid, but with a commutative comonoid, which allows you to talk about sort of copying distributions, but not in the same way as sort of Levier theory, which requires this sort of homomorphism or naturality property that means that the two copies are identical. Instead, it's a sort of a probabilistic copy. Okay, so what I'll move a bit faster, but what are these hypergraph categories trying to get at? And so here's a picture of two morphisms in a hypergraph category. One diagram is just the diagram on the previous slide, but that in some sense express exactly the same thing, in that they're just expressing a sort of connectivity pattern between these sort of morphisms F, G, and H. And the structure of the Frobenius monoids on every object sort of allows us to decide that this thing should be connected in this way, or that really we consider this as part of the domain here, but we can equally consider it as part of the codomain and just bend it around, and so on. And so you have a sort of a correspondence between sort of formations of these sorts in the syntax of hypergraph categories. And that points to sort of a deeper, sort of unbiased way to think about hypergraph categories, right? So to move things back up, in some sense, what we did was we started to talk about sort of we started to talk about colimits and a way of expressing these, and then we wanted to express this sort of these constructions in the syntax of monoidal categories because we like monoidal categories. So we did that, and then we discovered the syntax for hypergraph categories. But now I'm sort of going back the other direction and trying to look again for an unbiased syntax to really get at sort of to really understand what we've built. And an unbiased syntax is sort of given in this way. Instead of sort of thinking about our objects, our sort of morphisms, our sort of things that we're composing as things with domains and codomains, because of the technically a compact closed structure given by the hypergraph structure, the domains and the codomains don't matter so much. So we're just going to, instead of drawing boxes with a left-hand side and a right-hand side, draw these blobs. And then instead of sort of keeping track of whether we connected things in a binary way, our associativity law says we can draw these sort of four-way junctions if we like. So this diagram expresses what is really meaningful about these two things. These sort of give a nice bias presentation, which again, you can use the language of monoidal categories to comfortably construct, but this is the underlying expression. And it turns out, so going back to Cospans, this structure is exactly expressed by Cospans. So to see a bit how this is done, just in this example, for example, here we have these points. These points are the same as these ones on the left-hand side here. And then these outside points are the same as these ones over here on the right-hand side of the diagram. And then all we want to know is which interior points are connected to which exterior points. So for example, there's this connected component, I'll just use the same color here. And it connects sort of these two elements of these ports from H, these two ports from F, this port from H, and this exterior point 3. And so that's expressed by these functions that say, well, these interior points map to this connected component, and this exterior point maps to the same connected component. Okay, so we can view this as, in fact, the sort of underlying operand of hypergraph categories. And so to express that in a theorem, let me just write down some things very quickly. So a definition, a cospan algebra is a set lambda, which we think of as types, I guess, and a lax symmetric monoidal functor from this category that I'm going to call cospan fin set lambda to, I guess I should give you the monoidal structure too. So that's just the canonical structure, monoidal structure in a cospan category to set. So by this fin set lambda, what I mean is here the objects are finite sets, but they lie over lambda. They have a function to lambda that says for each variable. So if we think of lambda as a set of types, and we think of x as a set of variables, and it tells us the type of each variable. And of course, these functions or the morphisms in finset over lambda respects these types. So that's a cospan algebra, and I will say that a morphism of cospan algebras is a pair. So we have some cospan algebra over lambda and a cospan algebra over lambda prime. So I want a function that sort of takes the types of the first cospan algebra and turns it into perhaps product lists of types of the second cospan algebra. And then we also have the lax monoidal functor parts, right? So we have this functor to set, and that's the first cospan algebra. Have another functor from here, lambda prime to set. This function that maps over types lifts to a map of between the cospan categories, and then we want a natural transformation there. So this is, I mean, couched in the language of monoidal categories, but it could equally well be couched in the language of operads. And this is a standard notion of an operad algebra and a morphism of operad algebras. Okay, so let me give myself a tiny bit more space to state some results. Oh, crap, I've done that with the title again. So theorem 1 is that is some sort of coherence theorem for hypergraph categories that says every hypergraph category is equivalent to an object-wise free one. So this is where it's strict, and the monoid of objects is freely generated by some set, say lambda. And then we have this sort of equivalence of categories between object-wise free hypergraph categories and cospan algebras. So what this expresses is exactly this idea that all we care about in hypergraph categories, at least up to equivalence, is this sort of cospan algebra notion, the fact that it interprets these sort of composition diagrams that are completely unbiased. So this is some work in a paper with David Spivak on just called hypergraph categories. Okay, so that should give some sense of what hypergraph categories are. And I know I'm going a bit lengthy on time, so I will, but I want to get through in the last 2 minutes a sense of sort of what these decorated or structured cospans do. So one upshot of this notion, this sort of notion of cospan algebra, is that given a lax symmetric monoidal functor of this sort, right, what we can do is we can left Kahn extend to get a morphism out of cospan, and then given this fact that we know that there's these canonical Frobenius structures on cospan C, and we know that cospan fin set is the theory of Frobenius structures, of Frobenius monoids, we have sort of a canonical map here. And so we start with this functor F, this lax symmetric monoidal functor from C to set, and we end up with exactly a cospan algebra. And so explicitly, this cospan algebra is the structure given by, it corresponds to a hypergraph category, and this hypergraph category is exactly this sort of notion of a decorated cospan that we hinted upon earlier. So the resulting hypergraph cat has objects, the same objects as C, and the morphisms, sort of cospans in C, right? So pairs, cospans in C, and then some element of F of the apex, right? And in fact, moreover, there's a sort of slight generalization of this picture known as decorated correlations that can be used to construct any hypergraph category. So this is sort of a method of really presenting hypergraph categories from sort of a simpler sort of data, and we can get any hypergraph category of this sort. So this is some work by sort of with Mario Sarazola, who's also speaking in the seminar, I noticed, called A Recipe for Black Box Functors. Okay, so this doesn't quite get us to where we are in CatLab, though. There's sort of one more switch we need to do, and this is a generalization of this decorated cospan construction to be sort of double categorical. So this is a theorem by Jean-Blaise, Kenny Kosa, and Christina Vasikopoulou, which says that given sort of now instead of a lax monoidal functor, lax symmetric monoidal functor, a lax symmetric monoidal pseudofunctor from some category of finite colimits to cat, we can construct a symmetric monoidal double category of decorated cospans. And I guess the example you should think of, just to ground it a tiny bit more, is just this sort of example of graphs that we've been talking about. So if you have a functor from sort of fin set to sort of cat, that takes any finite set X to the set of graphs with this set X as its vertices. This notion of decorated cospan is exactly sort of a cospan of finite sets together with a decoration, which is an element of an object of this category of graphs. So we have some graph structure on the apex. And then finally, to link this with structured cospans, and some more work by the same people. If you have, but by Kenny Kosa in particular, if you have some functor L from C to some other category D, preserving finite colimits, then we can construct, then there exists again, a symmetric monoidal double category of structured cospans, which are, so the converse, cospans where the morphisms are, you think of these as the free graphs, and here's an apex, sorry, let's call these AX, L of B. And so these things are, these things we think of as free graphs, the objects are sort of, again, in this example, finite sets, and the morphisms here are categories, sort of are graphs. Sorry, the objects of the apex are graphs. So the corresponding sort of L to this functor here is just this sort of free functor from finite sets to graphs. Okay, and there's a body of work that shows that under appropriate conditions, these two constructions, structured cospans and decorated cospans, lead to isomorphic categories. So then the key point in the end to answer this question, sort of why structured cospans, is that these structured cospans are providing a convenient way of specifying hypergraph categories, which we think of as sort of mimicking sort of Cospan structure, or allowing us to sort of talk about constructing co-limits. Of course, I've sort of glossed over a few things where the literature is a little incomplete, but in this last part, there's no real accepted notion of hypergraph double category, but the double category, or at least the two categorical framework, is the right place to land. So really, this sort of should say hypergraph double categories, whatever that means. And then, of course, the implementation in CatLab, it gets at the structure, but I guess with more of a focus on computation. So not all of it is fully expressed. But now I've run over time, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great talk. Thank you, Brendan. Are there any questions or comments for Brendan? Please, Valeria, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, Brendan.
Hi.
Thanks to Tuan for organizing the seminars. It's great to have that many lovely seminars all over the place. The question is about lambdas. The question about functions, because all that we are doing here is dealing with co-limits.
Mm-hmm.
When are you going to bring kind of real functions into the picture? Kind of, the ability to bind variables, Brendan. When is that going to come into the picture, if at all?
Interesting. I'm not sure that it's necessarily part of the same story. I guess all I'm interested here is trying to find the minimal structure to expressing equality of variables or something like that in a way that can be conveniently exported to some computational library. And so I don't know whether we necessarily need to talk about functions, because in some ways we want to get away from expressing or working through that sort of paradigm anyway. The paradigm for expressing functions is very well established in computation. And the thrust of this work is to try and make sense of languages like circuit diagrams or Petri nets or some things that are more relational. And so in some sense, to build functions too heavily into the framework at the base level would detract from these objectives and make it less effective at its goals.
Fine, good. What about the products themselves? I mean, I'm kind of still trying to understand what make co-products and hence Cospans so enticing, so appealing.
Well, let's see. So I guess there's a nice story. Sorry for scrolling so fast. I don't know how to just fix slides. I mean, being able to express this in a more combinatorial way is, I think, itself. I mean, it's a very basic thing, and it's not available to us in most settings, but it's nice to be able to do. And then I'm actually still trying to figure out at what level, when you do this sort of work of producing these hypergraph categories, there's co-limits, there's some categories lurking in the background that exist where these things are all co-limits anyway. And that comes to the fore in the structured Cospan picture, where instead of like you're composing these structures, but in the decorated Cospans picture, you're making the composition in sort of the base category in the finite set, say, and everything else coming along for the ride. Whereas in the structured Cospan picture, you're lifting the sets into the higher category, the category of graphs or something, and doing your composition, your colimits there. And because of the equivalence of the two pictures, it makes me think that actually we haven't escaped too far from colimits anyway. But nonetheless, I think the vision is to have two worlds, one where, because colimits express naturally this notion of gluing and composition, we want a world where that is our world of interfaces, and we're taking advantage of all the structure there. But then we stick on top of it a world which has more semantic content, but that semantic content violates the nice categorical properties. Because in many ways, the project of applied category theory, I think, is to escape from the world where everything is beautiful and start like dealing with the nasty things that the genuine applications will throw up. And so when you ask sort of when will the products or co-products come into the picture, again, it's sort of hopefully they will stay in that spot.
Okay, thank you. That's lovely.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for the great question. Yeah, Mehmet, please go ahead.
So thank you very much. I want to ask, I mean, you said something about a category has finite colimits if and only if every object has a commutative monoid structure or something. Mm-hmm. I missed that, but I mean, is it? I mean, there is a source for it. How does it come from? Also, is there a dual version? For example, I mean, every a category has finite limits and if and only if a comonoid structure, etc.
Right. So sorry, we're scrolling very fast through things. So let me create a new slide. So the reference, I think, it's in fact about the limit case. I think it's Fox 71. It's a nice sort of 4-page paper.
Okay.
But to give a bit more detail, right? Again, yeah, the limit side is actually more familiar, right? It's sort of well known if you have a category of finite limits, you have these diagonals in every object, and these provide some sort of comonoid structure that allows you to sort of copy variables and so on.
Okay.
And then the notion of homomorphism. So if I draw this copy like this, what I want is that for any morphism F from sort of, I guess, these objects are X and these objects are Y, I want sort of this to hold, which says that basically, and this is sort of the naturality of the diagonal. And then we also want this to hold, right? So in some sense, we're moving the F through the dot, but there's no type on the other side, so it disappears. And so if you have a category where every object has one of these finite, these comonoid structures, commutative comonoid structures, and every morphism obeys these two equations, then it's exactly the same as a category with finite products.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a beautiful result that I was only aware of too recently.
Maybe after Carlos, I can ask another question. But
please go ahead, Mehmet. Ask
then
your question.
You also said something about a prop for finite sets are prop for commutative monoids.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you mean that their algebra over that props gives you commutative monoids or something? Or
yeah, let's see if
what does it mean?
Enough space to explain it in this slide. Sorry,
I'm not very familiar with props, but I assume that they are like something.
Yeah. So, sorry.
Are they something like lever theories?
Yeah. So it's a monoidal version of a Levier theory. So in a Levier theory, you have these finite product structures. So you're always allowed to copy variables. And if you want to be a bit more resource aware, then you should move to a setting like props, which don't let you copy things arbitrarily. But then it's exactly the same picture as in the Levier theory case. So when I say finite sets of the prop for commutative monoids, it's this sentence here. What I mean is that commutative monoid, so you can talk about a model for a theory, I guess, as, so here's my theory thin set, and a model is just a strict symmetric monoidal functor to another symmetric monoidal category. And so it's thin set is the theory for commutative monoids because there's this sort of natural correspondence between functors out of this into some arbitrary monoidal category and commutative monoid objects in that category.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can also do this if that helps bring into focus.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mehmet. Yeah, Carlos, please go ahead.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for this nice talk, Bernard. My question is so specific. It's about this Frobenius structure. I don't know if you could clarify for me why to ask this special property that when you compose coproduct and product, it has to be the identity. Yeah.
Right. I guess why can be answered in a number of ways. I mean, one reason that to want this law is because we're trying to mimic the structure of sort of cospans and whether you sort of, I guess it turns out that whenever you have this diagonal and co-diagonal in this cospan setting, that it always obeys this law. So we just sort of throw it in. But what it's expressing, the work it's doing for us in generality or in abstract is sort of saying that it doesn't matter if we have multiple witnesses saying that two things are equivalent. It's the same as just having one witness, like the extra witnessing. We could kind of view these things as witnesses that say that this thing is equal to this thing. And it doesn't matter, it's the same as just having a single witness. I know there are structures where you don't, I mean, commutative or just Frobenius monoids themselves, even non-commutative Frobenius monoids, but this law is itself very interesting in other settings. I think Joaquin Klock has a nice book on commutative monoids that deals with a lot of cases where they're not special, and it's sort of exactly Frobenius monoids in quantum field theory, I think.
Okay.
But I'm not so familiar with that part of the literature. So in short, we don't always want the special law, but it does arise naturally in this case and has a nice interpretation.
Yeah, I guess I get it. Yeah, because this map that you put it in squares, you want to flow through the lines, and this, I think this. Okay, thank you, Brandon. Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. I think, yeah, in that direction, I think you want to consider, or I think the idea here of Carlos was to consider maybe thinned out two-dimensional Bordisans or something like that. So this looks a bit like, so you have a, yeah, non-special Frobenius algebra structures. And anyway, yeah, Bob, yeah, please go ahead.
So just a question, cospans in the category A, it's the same thing as spans in the category A opposite. Mm-hmm. And so you could have done everything for spans instead of cospans, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so there's something, I mean, I sort of see a bit, you know, what's going on, but there's something sort of underlying, some extra structure there, which wants you to do cospans instead of spans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. It's sort of, I think, a deep point that I spent some time musing on and haven't really come up with a completely satisfying answer. But this dual nature of category theory makes it a bit silly to make claims about what is inherently a limit or inherent properties of colimits versus limits or cospans versus spans. because they're formally the same structure. But they feel very asymmetric to me as I work with them, right? Like I have a particular intuition for what working in a category of spans or relations is like, and it's very different from my intuition for what working in a category of cospans or correlations is like. And I think the asymmetry really just comes from the category of sets, which is sort of so fundamentally built into our intuitions. And that's sort of, I mean, that's I guess here, right? I started this talk with talking about thin set R, and that's the free category with finite limits, and then constructed this narrative, we wouldn't have this sort of intuition of gluing all the way through it.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's still to me not quite a satisfying answer, because again, the formal duality is still there. But I think that's the direction I search in when I think about things, just trying to understand why set is asymmetric itself and why we do category theory sort of almost based on the category of sets rather than say on the category of relations or an appropriate, I don't know, bicategorical structure.
Okay, it makes sense, yes.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the question though.
I just like spans better, you know, because I work with spans. Okay, you know, but yeah, no, that's good. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Yeah, I think Mehmet, do you want to ask something else?
Oh, sorry, I forgot the hand. But I may ask something about that. 2 weeks ago, there was Mike Schumann's talk, and they were talking about, I mean, he was talking about something like internal Frobenius objects.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to obtain such things in terms of spans?
I'm afraid I haven't watched Mike's talk, and I don't know the details of that setting. So yeah, I don't think I can be too insightful. But my instinct, having glanced at some of that stuff and not knowing exactly what he talked about, or if he talked about the stuff that I'm thinking of, is that it's a useful question to ask, and so sort of probably.
I mean, in general, I mean, the internal Frobenius object, an internal Frobenius object can be obtained like some kind of spans in that category, or anyway.
Yeah. I really hesitate to say too much without checking exactly what Mike was talking about. But I would guess that every, I don't know, categories of spans have internal Frobenius objects or something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehmet. Yeah, Sebas, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Brendan, for the talk. I really enjoy it. And so I have a question regarding the flow of information in the way that, so colimits in some way glue like the structures, and in some sense like dictates or can dictate like a path or a way information can be glued, right? So do you think that this process of taking colimits in some way has or can give us like a way or a path of least resistance, like in some way, like within within a category framework?
So there are two senses of direction that might be relevant here. The first is sort of direction within the structure itself that you're modeling. So within the categorical structure or something like that. So categories are directed structures. And then there's the direction of the modeling. So the fact that as you're trying to express these structures, you're building up your model sort of piece by piece in a directed way. And so that's not inherent to the structure itself, in that convenient, it's often most convenient to work in a directed way externally, and say, I place this piece down, and I don't know, if I had some wires, I have to go this way, and I connect it to this wire, and then I connect it this way, and that's a direction, and when I'm constructing my thing, but the wires themselves might just be bits of copper and completely undirected. And so I guess the point I want to make here is that hypergraph categories are this sort of directed framework for constructing things, but the actual thing they're trying to get at, as expressed through this notion of Cospan algebra, is completely undirected. And that's why you see, for example, here, that these sort of, in the hypergraph category pictures, these morphisms are sort of directed things, but they become undirected when I sort of look at what they're really trying to express. So to your question about whether this sort of stuff might be useful for constructing a sort of path of least resistance inside a structure, I wouldn't be too hopeful of hypergraph categories expressing that, because precisely hypergraph categories are trying to get the semantics of the thing you're trying to model. It should be an undirected thing. So to go back to Sophie's talk, since I've spoken to her about her work a bit, she's got this interesting thing where she has these resource sharing models which map onto what we're doing, but then she also has these directed composition models of dynamical systems. And in fact, she can sort of often view a certain system through one lens or the other. But to me, it seems the directed version rather than the resource sharing version is where you'd want to go for the sort of question that you're asking.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebas. Are there any other questions or comments for Brendan? Well, I do have 2 questions. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, in this, well, as long as you're on this slide, yeah, I think in the direction of Carlos's question, if you have well, suppose you have a hypergraph category or something like a hypergraph category where not Frobenius monoids are not special. Can you organize everything into drawings like this, into an opred, into an unbiased thing?
Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, the unbiasing really comes from, at least in terms of domains and codomains, comes from the directed, the compact closed structure. And so if and that comes from the Frobenius law itself and not the special law. So the point is that I can construct these sort of things that essentially, like this is multiplication followed by a co-unit. And it kind of turns this wire around, right? So there's this path through here like that. Or maybe the other direction if you prefer. And what I don't expect you to have memorized the sort of Frobenius laws, but this thing is equal to this thing by the Frobenius law, which is equal to the identity by unitality. And that's what gives us our compact closed structure. So even if you remove the special law, you still have this compact closed structure. And this means that sort of domains and codomains are somewhat interchangeable.
Okay.
But in terms of the operand that results, going back to Carlos's question, we don't get this nice collapsing. So I guess there are no examples in this, but it means that the operand would be unbiased, but this thing, something like this, which would be like if we could express this as an operand, it would be the same in the operand of Cospans. It would be the same as just the previous diagram that was there. But in a world without the special law, then these two things would be different composites.
Okay.
And so what would the underlying sort of operand, how do we construct the underlying operand? Instead of Cospans, it would be somewhat like Cospans with a map to the natural numbers. So we would just have an index, I think, to all of these things. And I think that would be the structure that you're getting at.
Okay.
So which would say like that this port, so where's this port? G3 and H2 are connected. So interesting. Oh yeah, G3 and H2 are connected. So this would have like a degree 2 on it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And could you say a bit more about what a hypergraph double category would look like?
It's a good question. I wish I had more time to think about it. My naive guess is just that. So I haven't written down anything. So we have this double category where, depending on your convention, I guess, the horizontal ones are the morphisms are the cospan. Wait, no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, you have horizontal cells that are cospans, and so that should have the hypergraph structure along with it. Whether you want also some compatibility between that and some appropriate structure in the other direction, like just having comonoids or something, I don't know.
Okay.
But at the very least, I don't know, it might be hypergraph double category is a double category where the horizontal dimension is the horizontal category is hypergraph.
Okay.
The way I would answer it is by looking at the structure of cospan, maybe cospan thin set as a double category. I mean, one thing that this notion of supplies motivates would be that you might construct some notion of a double prop and then say that cospan thin set is double prop, and then hypergraph double category is one that supplies cospan as a double category.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, if you think it, please let me know.
Yeah, I'll think about it. Yeah, it looks exactly like something I would like to think about. Yeah, thank you so much, Brendan. Yeah, well, are there any other questions or comments? If not, well, let's thank Brendan again. Thank you so much, Brendan, for the great talk.
Thanks.
We really enjoyed having you here.
It was lovely to be here. Lovely to meet you all. And I hope we all speak again soon.